and good evening. My name is Chantel Walker. I am the Assistant Director of the Marin County Free Library. Thank you for joining us. This learning session will be closed captioned. Spanish interpretation and ASL CDI interpretation is available via Zoom. Viewers may watch the webcast on the county's main Facebook page, the Community Media of Marin's educational channel. Comcast TV subscribers may watch on channel 30 or AT&T channel 99. You may also join via Zoom using the meeting ID and password available on the Marin County Free Library's website under Drake Boulevard Historic Resources. You'll see the banner as soon as you land on that page. To watch or listen in Spanish, join the Zoom webinar and click the interpretation icon and click Spanish. To ask a question during the event, use the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll do our best to address your questions. Please note, questions and comments on Facebook may not be captured during this webinar. Video recording of the session will be made available on the Marin County Free Library's website as soon as possible. Esta sesión de aprendizaje tendrá subtítulos. La interpretación en español y la interpretación de ASL CDI están disponibles a través de Zoom. Los espectadores pueden ver a la transmisión en vivo en la página principal de Facebook del Condado de Marin, el Centro de Medios Comunitarios. Los suscriptores de Comcast TV pueden mirar en el canal 30 o 99. También pueden participar a través de Zoom utilizando el ID de la reunión y la contraseña disponibles en la página de sitio del web de la Biblioteca del Condado de Marin en Drake Boulevard History Resources. Para ver o escuchar en español, los espectadores pueden utilizar la función del Zoom. Haga clic en el icon de interpretación. Seleccione español. Para hacer una pregunta durante el evento, use la función de preguntas y respuestas en Zoom. Haremos todo lo posible para abordar todas las preguntas. Tengan en pregunta el posible que no se capturan preguntas y comentarios en Facebook durante el evento. Una grabación del vídeo de la sesión estará disponible en el sitio del web de la Biblioteca del Condado de Marin. Gracias. Now I'll move to the welcome, since interpretation in Spanish as well as American Sign Language is available. Welcome again. Our agenda this evening is really driven by the many comments received about the renaming of Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. Widespread interest has grown over the last few weeks and months. I will be your moderator tonight. This learning session brings together information from a variety of perspectives. Our panelists this evening are from a cross-section of communities, and I personally have enjoyed learning some of the topics that we'll talk about. Additional resources about each of the topics can be found on the Marin County Free Library's website. We hope you'll take a look. Our first speaker this evening is Lorelle Ross, the Vice Chair of Federated Indians of Graton, Rancheria, who include the Coast Miwok people and the Southern Pomo. In addition to Lorelle Ross opening our panel and talking with us about both the history of the people of this land, but also the present, the evolving nature of all communities, we have Matthew Johnson, the Cultural Resources Specialist of the Federated Indians of Graton, Rancheria, and Buffy McQuillen, the Tribal Heritage Preservation Officer. We will start with these three panelists. Please feel free to begin entering your questions in the chat, and after we hear the full panel, we return to those. Lorelle, I turn to you now. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chantel, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to include the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria to ongoing dialogue regarding issues that are occurring within the tribal territory, as well as also being included when thinking about what kind of opportunities exist going forward to incorporate all perspectives of diversity and equity and inclusion. That said, I'd really like to share with our other colleagues, Buffy and Matthew, who I work with in my capacity as a council member, as an elected member to the 7-member tribal council, a little bit about who the Graton Rancheria people are. We are direct descendants of the Coast Miwok people. We are Coast Miwok of the Marin County. That said, I am Coast Miwok myself. My grandfather was Coast Miwok and grew up understanding the culture and the history and the importance of place, which is now in our ancestral lands of Marin County. So I will share with you a very long and very rich history and perspective of who we are, not just of the past, but who we are today as a living tribe. And that is where I'll start. The Graton Rancheria tribe is a federation of Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo groups from all of Sonoma and Marin County. The Southern Pomo of Sonoma County, just north of Marin County, is actually part of the ancestral lands that run all the way into the Coast Miwok tribal territory, and that's all of Marin County. Uniquely with the history that has been impacted from first contact as it's recorded by an outside narrative and perspective would be that of Sir Francis Drake from the Diary of a Chaplain aboard the Sir Francis Drake ship, in which in 1579 began a narrative from a different perspective. Of course, the perspective that I'm sharing with you today is more of who we are, passed on from generation to generation of amazing survivors and people that have endured all of the history from the time of Drake's landing, as well as into the Spanish mission, as well as into the Mexican and American periods to today. So in 20 minutes and sharing this with Buffy and Matt and everyone else on the panel today, I will highlight some notable points that have been passed on in my own culture and tradition. Our culture is predicated on a deep understanding and a deep discipline of having stayed in our tribal homelands for thousands of years. Our elders say since time immemorial. We have archaeological evidence and other types of science-based evidence that states that our ancestors can trace resources and cultural remains back to over 10,000 plus years. From a cultural perspective, it's less important for me for you to understand when that time began, because our creation stories tell us it began within Marin County. And for every significant cultural landscape there is throughout Marin County, from inland to coastland to the mountaintops of Mount Tam, have been a part of who we have been as people who lived on the land and steward the land. Part of our present day existence as a tribe is to continue on the values and to continue on with the mission of social justice, environmental stewardship, which includes the ancestral territory of Marin. Interestingly enough, since a lot of the emphasis today is about talking about Sir Francis Drake, I would encourage all to look out for more information and resources to actually learn more about who the Coast Miwok people are of Marin County, and to also be a party of today's discussion is really to bring awareness that we are a living tribe and that we have a lot of connection and continue to engage in Marin County as it is part of our ancestral land. A lot of us that have been involved over the years in the tribal reorganization and restoration, which started in the early 90s, are all tracing our lineage and our genealogy back to historical records that have been preserved through mission time and basically survivors from an era that created a lot of disease and decimated population. We are all survivors of a genocide through an American history that early on was not favorable towards Native Americans and certainly within the Coast Miwok tribe. We ourselves have lived through and survived through an era of major disruption since the landing of Drake and that recorded history. That said, we have survived through the Spanish period with Mission San Rafael being established in 1817 as what was really the first sanitarium for in California, and it was really to treat sick Indian people. I have direct ancestry to people who were treated in Mission San Rafael, many who did not survive because of lack of immunity to diseases and strains of new types of diseases and destruction and displacement of our homelands. That said, many of the Aboriginal villages, ancestral villages within Marin County, many people of the Indian population had to seek refuge to the mission, whether it was refuge by choice or by circumstance. They run risk of having been slaughtered or murdered or enslaved. That is the history in which I come from. As moving forward with a time where there were Mexican ranchos and grants, there are a rich history in Marin County and direct descendants who lived within those ranchos and at times were allotted a land grant in a unique part of Marin County that we have direct descendants from as well. That said, as the Mexican period ended and gold rush came in California, the statehood of California occurred in 1850. One of the first laws that was passed in California was actually an act for the government protection of Indian people. That act, in fact, with their ironic title, is what actually legalized slavery of California Indians and became another dark shadow on our history. Not only had we survived through disease, through having no immunity and the missionization, the secularization, and the Spaniard shifting of taking over the landscape and our homeland and displacement and dislocation that caused, we once again were then created a genocide here in America on the soils in which we all descend. Ironically, we talk about a name for a road after someone who spent such little time here when there is a living tribe of over 1,400 direct descendants who are Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo directly from Marin and Sonoma County. Many of us have that direct ancestry to the Marin County, such as myself and Matt, who is also a tribal citizen. That said, you know, we persevere and we continue to tell the stories that our ancestors have been able to hold, and a culture that keeps us tied to the landscape, the significance of coast and inland of the Marin and Sonoma counties. With that, I'd like to introduce you to Buffy McQuillen, who is a staff person and Native person herself, although not of the Graton tribe, that has worked tirelessly for cultural justice for not just Graton, but for other Native Americans, to talk with you about some of the active efforts that my tribe is directly involved in regarding protection of cultural sites and cultural landscape in Marin County. Oftentimes not very visible, but it is protecting the remnants of our ancestors as well as the remnants of our cultural landscape that has been greatly altered through the years. So Buffy, thank you for joining today. Buffy, I'm not sure if the audio is working for you.
Got it. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, everyone. So yes, as Lorelle said, I'm Buffy McQuillen. I'm the Tribal Heritage Preservation Officer for Graton Rancheria. I'll give a little bit of context to what that means today, as Lorelle mentioned.
If you don't mind, we will have an interpreter switch. So if we can pause for just one moment. Thank you very much. Please continue.
No problem. As Lorelle mentioned, you know, as a present day tribe, Graton Rancheria created a Tribal Heritage Preservation Office. And to give you some context of what that means, essentially in 2013, the tribe, by tribal resolution and with the National Park Service, assumed responsibilities to operate a heritage preservation office. And so part of the responsibilities is to manage and protect sacred sites. And as Lorelle mentioned, for me and my work, I've been doing that for a little bit, I would say a little bit shy of 20 years. I myself am Native American. I'm not Coast Miwok. I am, if you believe in the terminology from anthropologists, I'm from the area that's considered, I guess, the central Pomo region. I'm originally from Ukiah area, from Ukiah Rancheria, and I'm an enrolled tribal citizen of Round Valley Indian tribes. I've done a lot of work here in mostly Northern California, and have been with Graton Rancheria for a little over 5 years. So a lot of the work that we do in our office is work with primarily local agencies, other jurisdictions who are permitting development projects in Sonoma and Marin counties. Much of our work is review of anthropological, archaeological information, working with developers and engaging in tribal consultation. As Lorelle mentioned, it's, you know, a vast territory in Marin County. Most of the work that we do is in Marin County, and working with a lot of those agencies who are permitting projects. So we do a lot of sacred site protection. There's a significant number of sites in Marin County, and the tribe has been doing that work for well over 30 years. And I think that's my part, Lorelle.
Thank you, Buffy. Before I introduce Matt, I just want to also say a large part of the work that we do, which sometimes is not always visible to the masses or to the local community, having gone through getting our federal recognition in 2000, so much of our reorganization in the early 1990s was really just trying to bring awareness a lot in Marin County and Sonoma that, one, California Indians are alive and thrive. The other is for a very long time, and we often in Marin County were facing, oh, we thought you all were dead. And oftentimes, you know, hidden right in plain sight is the truth or a history and a people and a culture, and that is rooted to place. And, you know, to this day, we often do a lot of education and outreach, and oftentimes are meet people who are reaching out, a lot of schools and teachers that are wanting to find a deeper sense of history and connect to a place and a truth. And that's where we find a lot of the outreach. For so many years early on in securing our rights back through our survivorship, our slogan was, "We are still here." I can distinctly remember a tribal elder and former council member, Jean Bouvelat, who was instrumental in founding and reorganizing our tribal government, and who lived in Marin County for a very, very long time. He was often single-handedly educating many families and individuals about the fact that we are still here. A lot of that education is the work that Matt does. And with that, I'd like to hear from you, Matt, to share with our audience today how we do outreach and education, not just with our tribal citizenry, but also with lots of agencies and schools. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lorelle. I'm Matthew Johnson. I am a tribal citizen enrolled with the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria. I am Miwok. My family comes from Tamales Bay, near the town of Marshall. And I've been working for my tribe for just a little over 10 years now. And I know for the sake of time, I'm going to try to encapsulate all the work that my department is doing in a couple brief minutes here. So 10 years ago, I started working with our tribal youth, developing after school and summer camp programs. And from there, I was a part of a team that wrote a grant to expand our tribal library and archive. And when Buffy came on board with the tribe, we created our cultural resources department. And that was kind of the umbrella that all of the information we have in our library and our archive sort of fell under that umbrella. And so we are the keepers of all the really important information that the tribe has collected over the years. We have a number of very rare pieces of material about the Coast Miwok culture that are very hard to find. So we like to consider ourselves a one-stop shop for all information regarding the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people. And I was very fortunate to have shadowed two of our elders, as Lorelle mentioned, Jean Bouvelat and Joanne Campbell, who is also a former tribal council member. They had been doing presentations in classrooms for a number of years, and I sort of learned the ropes really quickly from them, and have created a presentation that I do for a number of different organizations throughout Sonoma and Marin County, which includes schools, and I've been to different organizations and presented to their staff on the history of the first people of the area in which they do their work. I've presented to classes of folks that are doing work towards achieving their United States citizenship, and just talked about how our tribal government works and things like that. So it really is my goal, and we are dedicated to keeping our voice alive in the greater community of Marin and Sonoma counties, and making sure our side of the story is told, which on the subject of Sir Francis Drake, you know, a lot of the information that's out there was written from the European perspective. So we're trying to do our best to represent our thoughts as tribal people on that subject. But you have to kind of keep in mind too that there was definitely a language barrier during those interactions. So it's hard for us to really speak on how that interaction between Sir Francis Drake and the Coast Miwok people in 1579 might have gone down. But we're doing our best to stay visible, to keep reminding the community that we are still here and we are keepers of a lot of knowledge. So thank you for having me here.
Just in closing, I'd like to just end on a quote from our tribal chairman, Greg Saris, who has been our leader and part of the tribe's reorganization in the early 90s to present day, and all the success that my tribe, Matt's tribe, has had and continues to contribute to the larger community, Native and non-Native. This was a part of a statement that he made back in 2016 at the landmark plaque dedication during the designated historical landmark that exists at the Limitor Beach in Point Reyes in honor of Sir Francis Drake. Ironically, Chairman was a speaker there, but shared a lot of thoughts. And one thought that resonates with me that I wanted to share with the public today in closing is a quote in part from his speech, which is in reference to the dedication space out at the Limitor Beach. Use this marking spot, this place, to create a dialogue once again based on respect, equality, and power in all things. I hope that was part of today, and as we're opening our minds and our hearts to a path forward. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Chantel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lorelle, very much, and thank you, Matt and Buffy, also. We will have a question and answer section later, and given your 24 years on the Tribal Council and your 10 terms as Vice Chair, there's several questions that will be coming up, and I'll come back to you on about what does your community think about the naming of this roadway? And what are some ways that you know about Drake's history and his impact? So we'll come back to that after our next two speakers. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jordan Leeser. Jordan, please turn your camera on. He is an assistant professor at Dominican University, and he began his academic career studying environmental engineering at Cal Poly. His work here in Marin has focused, and his conversation here will focus really on historiography, this opportunity to think about perspectives on Sir Francis Drake over periods of time. Jordan, I turn to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just gonna do that classic pause while I open up the PowerPoint here. I want to give a special thank you to the county for inviting me, and the Marin County Free Library especially for reaching out and asking for a brief presentation. And it is hard for historians to be brief, but I will do the best I can. So I have about 30 pages of notes that I've condensed down into this 20-minute time, so I'll get out as much as I can. And I'll start in a way where you can tell that I'm a teacher, in that I'll start with a question. And this is sort of what my students might call a wall of text, but it's okay if you can't read it all at once. But the question is, how can there be such different historical views on Sir Francis Drake? And I've been kind of monitoring the question and answers, and you know, if you've been sort of, I think anyone's been paying attention, you can probably recognize that that's a very possible thing. And if you look at these different quotes, you get a pretty good idea from John Sugden on the left, who even mentions the idea of sort of Elizabethan era abolitionist, or the nearest they go, to Richard White, who talking about robbing and raping and murdering his way up the Pacific coast, to Harry Kelsey calling him a rogue and a pirate, to Herman Arthur, who talks about this idea of myth and counter myth, which I think is also quite interesting. But anyway, all four of these scholars are indeed scholars. If we were to sort of go across all of them, I would say they would well be over 100 publications. They all have advanced degrees. They're all credible. So how is this possible, right? That's the question, right? How can there be such a distinct difference? And again, these are all relatively recent, right? If you're talking about someone who's over 400 years old, 22 years is not really all that long ago. So the first question I want to answer here, or the first way I want to answer this for you, is by phrasing the well-known historical philosopher R.G. Collingwood, who wrote, quote, "Nothing that can be memorized is history." You see, the word history can often be used with different meanings. But for tonight, I want to talk about history as sort of an academic discipline. Historians are trained to look at the past using a wide range of methodologies, right? Through peer review and sort of good research. You know, historians, we like to pride ourselves on an effort to remain objective-minded. However, all historians are products of their own time periods and are beholden to the sources available to them at the time. And of course, there's other limitations and biases that can come in there as well. So a critical element of understanding any sort of deep dive into Drake, in my view, is this historiography, which tonight means sort of the untangling of the historical record, or the history of the history, if you will, of Sir Francis Drake. So I did provide a timeline. This is if there's any questions, I can kind of come back to it. I don't have time to kind of go through the entire history here, but it is here if we need it later. This is another timeline. This is the timeline of the historiography, or the history of the history, or perhaps you could call it the different perspectives over time. And it is vast. And I should probably point out that this is really just one small string. Sir Francis Drake is really just a small piece of a much larger history that really is encompassing of British maritime history, imperialism, the Elizabethan era, and more generally, the early modern European history, right? Sometimes remembered as sort of the Renaissance period, right? As one person might guess, a lot of the people that write on British imperial history are indeed British themselves. And Drake is really, again, like I said, a single thread of that. So let's kind of go through this sliver, though, because I think this is what we care about today anyway, and start off with the first category. So I've sort of categorized each of the different sort of schools as they progressed over time. The first is the early work. So who were the first people to write about Drake? And really, this is an interesting thing. And of course, you can always see this happening, I think, in today's world as well. But the first people to write about Drake were people that were writing while he was still alive. That they were either, like relatives. He actually has a number of relatives that wrote some of the early copies. We also have sort of people that were on board the ship that were with him. And they write their own testimonies. Of course, they are providing sort of primary source evidence within their larger storytelling. There's a number of sources that reference El Drake, which means dragon, and as the Spanish knew him. And as you might imagine, those also have a certain sort of perspective. So those are sort of the earliest types of work here. In the second category, we have the Victorian bias. So the Victorian bias is an important part of the school of thought here. Really, it begins and ends in the 1800s. And this is an important part of the large story. But British historians really dove heavily into the Elizabethan era in the 1800s. And the reason why this is interesting is it's actually not just historians. It's sort of this popular move to talk about them. And I think there's a connection here that I'll get to in a second, but three great examples are up on the screen. We have Charles Kingsley's historical novel called Westward Ho, and then Newbolt's poem, Drake's Drum. And these are very much sort of the hero creation myth of Drake, where he gets credit for a lot of things. His life becomes oversimplified, I would argue. The personal life sort of fades away, and some of his great deeds, such as the Battle of the Spanish Armada, the defeat at the fleet at Cadiz, circumnavigation, these are really the highlight of everything going on here. And I picked one biography, Julien Courbet's Sir Francis Drake from 1898, because it is something that's still read today. In fact, if you just were to pick up a random biography, there's a good chance you might pull this one off the shelf. And Courbet definitely fits within this sort of Victorian myth building category. And just one sort of example of the way that he paints this picture of Drake is pretty interesting in that he paints this idea, and I'm not agree with Professor Claire Jowett, who says that the Elizabethan sea dogs became a sort of kindred spirit for the flourishing naval-dependent British global imperialism they were living through. And really what happened here is a sort of overglorification, right? And Drake did, of course, have a pretty extraordinary life, but in this category, they sort of lump all of those, in quote, Elizabethan sea dogs together, including his cousin, John Hawkins, and a few others. And Courbet falls into this trap, I think, pretty easily. He offers high praise, right? And one thing that this group does is really frame the story of Drake as being one of sort of overcoming religious persecution. And this is an important part of the story that I think does move forward, and it is important to remember the key context here. And just a brief moment on that. A lot of people look at Henry VIII as a start of the English Reformation.
Jordan,
Yes,
as we go into context, could we pause for just a moment
of course.
to transfer interpreters? And we want to make sure that we speak at a pace that they can fully interpret.
Okay, I'll do the best I can, although I'm cramming a lot of information in here. So
I understand. Thank you. Please continue.
Okay, so the context that Corbet's introducing is this idea that the Reformation didn't happen instantaneously, just because Henry VIII, like that old Beatles song, right, talks about creating, basically flipping a switch and switching the religion of an entire small empire. It doesn't really happen. So it actually takes a few other monarchs over time, after Edward. And then, of course, there's that period of time from 1553 to 1558 where Mary takes over. And her reign, again, is relatively brief, but of course is also quite famous as she's been given that moniker, Bloody Mary. And the reality is that most sort of people living in England at that time remained Catholic for some time. So Drake's Protestantism, according to the Victorian bias school of thought, is really one that puts him sort of at odds with much of the world, and perhaps is one of the impetuses for him wanting to sort of leave home and find sort of perhaps better opportunities out there than was current for them at home. All right. And I'm going to flip forward. Again, I have another wall of text for you. We can come back to these if we'd like to. But on the left, I have a small excerpt of how Julian Corbett treats his role in the slave trade. It's interesting that there's 200 pages in this biography, and less than 1 page is dedicated to his participation in the slave trade with Hawkins. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that the sources for that are more limited in terms of what Drake's particular role was. Not as much. We know quite a bit more about Hawkins, but they talk about this. And if you read through this, essentially the blame falls onto the Spanish, meaning that Bartolome de las Casas here is sort of the impetus for creating the African slave trade, and we could go 20 minutes just on that. And at the end here, there's sort of like, it's almost like this sort of easy way out, right? Oh, this English understanding nothing, and the old Puritan captains went on hunting slaves, just as they prayed and fought with all their hearts and with all their strength, and never knew a reason why they should not. It's almost like, they were not smart enough to know that this was not the right thing to do. But of course, that's the sort of historiography from the 1800s. Things have really moved quite far from there. And in fact, sorry to flip back, but if you were to look at these other quotations from more recent works, you can see a much more nuanced understanding of the slavery, especially the slavery and how it's changed over time here in Bradford's Drake, which is a great work from 1965. And that one falls within this first wave revisionist category. So the first wave revisionist is really a longer period. I would say, you really say it spans much of the 20th century. And these revisionists are definitely combating some of the things that the Victorian bias sort of school of thought laid out there. But they're really, for the most part, broadening the story, which in history is always great. And this is why history is a process, right, where we understand more and more over time. And the widening of the story is important. I mean, there's even a work directly just on John Hoggin's third slaving voyage. There's a whole book just on that, right? We've come a long way from just having a poem about all of Drake to having an entire monograph just on that. Great name to mention here is Kenneth Andrews, who wrote a few different pieces that are relevant to Drake's story. And I would say he's sort of a significant revisionist to remember. And he's not necessarily changing the story, but he's definitely tackling some of those sort of Drake biases that we see in the Victorian era and really providing a lot more understanding. The two most recent works fall, and I've heard a lot of people talk about these works, would be what I call the second wave revisionist, which is most represented by Harry Kelsey's Sir Francis Drake, the Queen's Pirate. Harry Kelsey is a research scholar at the Huntington Library, and he also teaches at UC Riverside. And it's quite the volume. It is very rich. He makes extensive use of Spanish sources, some of which had not really been tapped well before. And it also is sort of excessively footnoted and it's very transparent, which I very much appreciate. Kelsey's thesis deserves its own category because he really does sort of break down everything that even the first wave revisionists were sort of assuming to be true. And I have a few of examples here, but generally the thesis is around this idea that Drake was a greedy person. And that sort of drives, sort of this economic argument sort of drives him to do all of the things he did, including slaving and other things. And he very distinctly that says Drake is a pirate, not a privateer or an agent of reprisal. And I will point out that he does have a mark of reprisal through Hawkins. So there is some sort of disagreement among Kelsey and many of these other historians on some of these points, including that one. Well, some of the other sort of things that he does, Kelsey really tries to frame his work as sort of shattering the Victorian era rose-tinted glasses that I spoke of before. And again, that's not a new idea, especially by 98, but he very much is taking that sort of perspective as he moves forward. So one of the things that he claims is that Elizabeth held disdain for Drake. In fact, the two were not that close. He really digs into the concept that at one point after circumnavigation and bringing home this large amount of treasure, Queen Elizabeth famously went on the ship of the Golden Hind, his flagship, and called him my pirate. And basically that's all for show, according to Kelsey. And really she wanted to distance herself from him as much as possible. Other sort of criticisms that he has of Drake is saying that he doesn't do a very large role in the Spanish Armada. He also says that it was basically that the attack at Cadiz was basically a sort of flawed tactical error, not as much of a success as most other scholars argue. He also claims that there's no way that Drake sailed anywhere near San Francisco Bay. I think he says that the furthest north he got was possibly around modern-day Santa Barbara. These points are all minority opinions, I would argue, from Kelsey's view. If you look at the wave of all these historians, and there really are a lot. I mean, just by my own estimate, there's probably over 1,000 scholarly resources on Drake, and I looked at a good number of them. But these are sort of minority opinions. However, there are two that I think really good points that he makes. One is on the conflict he had with a good friend, Thomas Doherty. Thomas Doherty was a nobleman from England that was added to the journey, and he didn't really know they were going around the world. It's one of the sort of interesting takeaways is that Drake didn't tell everybody we were going on circumnavigation, but Doherty was there. So imagine for signing up for that trip and then realizing how much further, how much more dangerous that would be. And he basically claims that this is a murder. That basically the harshest crime that Drake ever handed out himself was on his own ship as captain, and it was the eventual trial and then execution of Doherty, who is again a sort of noble person back in England. And the other great point he brings up is something that's also mentioned by Richard White in his book California Exposures, and this is about Maria and the fact that Maria and two other freed slaves that were from the Spanish Main, the Spanish sort of colonial area in the Americas. And at one point they were freed or liberated by Drake and his crew. And then later they would be abandoned on the west coast of the Americas without water. And most likely either Drake or one of his crew members had also impregnated Maria. So there's the accusation, or I guess the reading between the lines, that this is perhaps rape, although that's not explicitly said even in Kelsey's text right here. Now, there's a lot to admire, I think, in Kelsey's book, but I think it also is a little bit, you need to have some caution, because the way that history often works over time is that people like Kelsey can really bring forth these important questions, and the historiography is just going to continue to go. So if it's definitely without something like Kelsey, we wouldn't get these sort of questions.
I want to thank you very much for beginning that conversation, Jordan. And a number of the questions that were asked, and we'll come back to some questions that you've begun to touch on about, is there concurrence around Drake, specifically his connection to the slave trade and enslaved African peoples. So we will come back to you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for getting us started.
Okay.
And
thank
again,
you so much.
Thank you. And again, everyone, this recording will be posted, so you'll have a chance to really go over some of those slides and the great walls of text, but I think they had a lot of good information there. Thank you. Next, we will go to Dewey Livingston. Dewey Livingston is a historian who's been working with our California room and has done the history of Marin and West Marin in particular for quite some time. Dewey, please prepare to bring your slides up. One of the questions that we'll really be moving into here is the naming of the roadway itself. After Dewey has a chance to share some of the ideas about the naming of the roadway and talk to you about some resources that he's published off of the California Room and the Marin County Free Library website, we'll then turn to questions that we've received. Dewey, please go ahead.
All right. Okay, do you see that all right? And do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're doing great.
This is where we're getting just into the nuts and bolts of the road itself. So I'm just going to start with a little history of Sir Francis Drake Highway, or Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, really. Sir Francis Drake Boulevard's been the name of the major east-west corridor in Marin County for the past 91 years. It's the result of at least 7 roads of different names developed in the early days of the county. And in the 1930s, these roads were consolidated as a continuous link from San Francisco Bay to the tip of Point Reyes, about 43 miles in length. And the naming, as you'll see, was largely a decision based on civic boosterism in Marin County, with the Golden Gate Bridge approaching completion and offering an opportunity to build Marin's economy and raise the standard of living during the Great Depression. So the road begins on the east at Interstate 580 near San Quentin State Prison and passes through the suburban communities of Larkspur, Greenbrae, Kentfield, Ross, San Anselmo, and Fairfax before heading, what we say, over the hill to the rural San Geronimo Valley. At the west end of the valley, it enters the redwood forests of Samuel P. Taylor State Park and the ranch lands within Golden Gate National Recreation Area before it reaches Highway 1 at the village of Olema. Drake follows Highway 1 for 2 miles north before turning west again on the outskirts of Point Reyes Station, and there it follows the west shore of Tomales Bay, through Inverness, and over what we call Ottinger's Hill into Point Reyes National Seashore. And that's through dairy and cattle ranches before it terminates at the Point Reyes Lighthouse. So the road got its start as a trail. By tradition, one of the many routes used by the Coast Miwok people to travel between San Francisco Bay and Tomales Bay and to Point Reyes proper and its rich hunting grounds. This route was the most direct between villages in the vicinity of San Rafael and Olema and the seasonal encampments on the point and around Tomales Bay. And it's likely that these ancient trails were followed by Spanish and Mexican conquerors during the mission period and up into the late 1840s. And this would be the transportation network existing at the time of statehood in 1850. Here's a diseño, a map made during the Mexican era showing the Camino to San Rafael in the San Geronimo Valley. And it is likely that these new routes taken by the Mexicans and beyond were based on the Coast Miwok routes. And during the 1850s and early 1860s, after the Coast Miwok had been forced off of their traditional land and European settlers made their homes here, horses and wagons followed the Olema Trail, which likely mimicked the Miwok route. Olema had been a large Miwok village and in the late 1850s became one of the major towns in Western Marin, and its name is derived from a Coast Miwok word. So the entirety of today's roadway, called Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, had its origins in at least 7 separately administered segments. And let's look at those briefly, east to west. The 2 segments between Kentfield and San Quentin, and on the screen, Ross Landing in the upper left is now Kentfield. It started as one and was divided by the new Highway 101 in 1930. And this part of the road that we're seeing here was built in the 1860s as a connection between Ross Landing and the ferry at San Quentin. And, oh, there we go. And it was further improved in 1930 by convict labor from San Quentin to connect communities to the west, like San Anselmo, and the east and the Richmond Ferry, with the new 3-lane State Highway 1 that would be right sort of in the middle there. That's where 101 is now. The road was straightened through Greenbrae in the 1950s as that community grew out of the picturesque dairy pastures. And until 1933, this road was usually called the Kentfield Greenbrae Road, or just the Greenbrae Road. Now, the oldest of these 7 segments is probably the one from Kentfield to San Anselmo Junction. As part of the county road between Sausalito and San Rafael that was developed in the 1850s, this segment was usually called the Red Hill Ross Landing Road. And this picture is of Ross Landing around 1870, and the roadway going across the bottom of the screen, it was today's Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. And the pasture over there to the right is College of Marin. That's College Avenue leaving off to the left towards Larkspur. In the 1850s through the 1870s, Ross Landing, which later became Kentfield, was the busiest port in Marin County, with shipments of lumber, paper, and dairy produce pouring out of the surrounding hills and valleys. It remained with the name Ross Landing Road well into the 20th century and was a section of Highway 101 for a few years before the opening of the more direct and modern Eastern Highway in 1930. This is a view looking from Red Hill across San Anselmo and towards Fairfax. So the San Anselmo to Fairfax section was part of the developed county road between San Rafael and Olema that was laid out in the 1860s by County Surveyor Hiram Austin. With Lagunitas, San Geronimo, and Nicasio growing in countywide importance, a good road was needed to San Rafael. In 1865, the county constructed a new road from what would become Fairfax over White's Hill and through the San Geronimo Valley. And they replaced a steep trail up White's Hill at the time. In 1867, Austin continued the survey of this road between Lagunitas and Olema. So here Austin laid out a road hugging Lagunitas Creek, passing Taylor's paper mill and heading over Bolinas Ridge to the growing town of Olema. And this was named the San Rafael Olema Road and usually just called the Olema Road. And when Point Reyes Station was founded by the North Pacific Coast Railroad in 1875, a good road from Olema to Point Reyes Station was built. And this is today Highway 1, just north of Olema. So in 1873, Austin designed a new road to Point Reyes that followed the west shore of Tomales Bay, past the future site of Inverness, to the Point Reyes Lighthouse. A cutoff to this road across the marshes near Point Reyes Station was completed 3 years later. So by the mid-1870s, all the section of the road, now called Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, were in place, although in primitive state by today's standards. These narrow dirt roads with rickety wooden bridges were dusty in the summer and muddy in the winter, but they served the population well. The North Pacific Coast Railroad, which paralleled the old road, led most coastal travelers to take the train rather than that rigorous road route. And this is a picture at Forest Knolls looking east towards San Geronimo. So it took a half a century to see modern improvements in the road. The automobile basically was invented, and so that changed things all over the place. So from horse and wagon to an automobile. So by the teens, most of the roads in town were paved, but the rural routes to Point Reyes, Bolinas, and Tomales continued to serve as bone-jarring relics of the past. In 1925, Marin voters passed a $2.5 million road bond that promised wide paved modern roads to connect to the coast. These improvements focused on moving the agricultural products of Western Marin to market, offering a more efficient mode of travel by truck than the fading old 50-year-old railroad line. So most of the bond money went to what was called the Manor to Point Reyes Road. And this new road followed the old county road between Western Fairfax and Point Reyes Station, but wider with curves smoothed and grades eased, and it was to be paved with concrete. And many of us know from experience until recently that the concrete didn't really work out that well. It cracked and made a pretty uncomfortable ride out to the coast. Now, Manor was a train stop and still a bus stop, although the bus stops moved down the road a bit, on the western side of Fairfax. This is what it looked like in the 1920s. And Point Reyes Station was a commercial and agricultural center serving the area around Tomales Bay and Point Reyes. So hence the Manor to Point Reyes Road was the official name of it. So crews graded the roadbed in 1926 to 27, with County Surveyor John C. Oglesby designing handsome concrete bridges to span the 3 crossings of Lagunitas Creek, as well as others on the San Geronimo Creek. So after letting the new gravel road settle for 2 years, between June and October of 1929, contractor J.V. Galbraith poured sections of concrete, starting at the west edge of White's Hill and ending at a new steel truss bridge in Point Reyes Station. So the new highway to the coast was a big deal for the farmers and the merchants in Olema and Point Reyes Station. And the name so far given, Manor to Point Reyes Road, left much to be desired. A prominent storekeeper in Point Reyes Station offered his idea to the public. Wilford J. Salachi, who was known as Bill, owned the Point Reyes Emporium, one of the major stores in Point Reyes Station. In July of 1929, as the new highway was being paved, Salachi wrote a letter to the San Rafael Independent offering an idea that he felt would enhance commerce in West Marin, as well as the county as a whole. Bill was an active member of the booster organization called Marvelous Marin, and he suggested a famous name for the future road. And he wrote, "This highway is the most important in the county as it is the main artery through the county, and a name that will tie in with some event or part of our own history would do much to secure some of the advertising that Marin County is desirous of getting today." For instance,
let's take a pause for a moment to switch interpreters.
Good.
Thank you. Please begin again.
For instance, with the completion of the Golden Gate Bridge, it will be the desire and ambition of every tourist visiting California to cross this gigantic structure. Crossing this bridge into marvelous Marin, where our natural beauties must appeal to travelers from all over the country. Now, if such a name as the Sir Francis Drake Highway would be acceptable to the county at large, try to visualize for a moment the publicity that would be obtained therefrom. The discovery of California by Sir Francis Drake as a part of the history in every state of the Union. So therefore, the adoption of this name would make the publicity as complete or more so than any name that could be approved of. The extension of the present highway to that part of the county first discovered by Drake is only a matter of a few years. And if you have any doubts of the merits of such an outstanding title, take this trip some Sunday, and I have no doubt that you will agree that West Marin has something wonderful to offer in the way of landscape and scenery. And he closed his letter stating his belief that the name would be one, quote, "the county will be proud of hundreds of years hence." Well, maybe not. As he noted with the coming Golden Gate Bridge, Salachi's suggestion was based entirely on bringing business from tourists and new residents to Marin and its coast. So Marvelous Marin ran with Salachi's idea, and the new highway from Fairfax to Point Reyes Station was dedicated by that organization as Sir Francis Drake Highway on November 16, 1929 in Olema. It was high school student Mary Menzies who announced to the crowd, "In memory of those brave men who landed on the shores of Marvelous Marin in 1579, I christen this highway Sir Francis Drake." That day, the Marin Journal editorialized, and I quote, "The completion of Sir Francis Drake Highway means millions of dollars of increased value to property owners," unquote. So plans for a physical memorial to Drake and a new park moved forward, although one was never created along the highway. Much news coverage followed with pages of advertisements for West Marin visitors. Now, let's change course just a little here and talk about why the suggestion to name the highway after Drake came to be. It's no doubt that because of the name applied to Drake's Bay, which was the eventual destination of the road. While the early map makers used the name as early as 1625, the exact location was not known because of the inaccuracy of the maps of the time. And it wasn't until 1792 that the name was clearly marked on the bay on a chart by Captain George Vancouver. That's the one you see here from 1792. So that seemed to cement into place the accepted landing site and led the US Coast Survey to apply the name Drake's Bay in the early 1850s, shortly after California became a state. The noted federal coastal geographer George Davidson published a paper about Drake's Landing in 1887, determining that in his opinion, Drake's Bay was the site. So a new publication by anthropologist Zelia Nuttall called A New Light on Drake appeared in 1914, arousing new interest in Drake's history and landing site. The Sir Francis Drake Association was formed to commemorate Drake's landing in Drake's Bay, and in 1916 erected a monument at the chosen site near Chimney Rock, far out on the point. And starting that year, the association led annual pilgrimages to the site, which went on for at least 40 years, later at a different site. They were led by priests, with much of the pageantry intended to commemorate the first Christian services held in California by Drake's chaplain, Francis Fletcher. I believe the man second from the left in this picture is the Bishop of California. So this dedication was considered to be a very important event in the life of the church. A substantial Christian cross was put up by the Sir Francis Drake Association in 1949 at Drake's Beach, which at that time was a county park. The 7-foot tall granite cross was dedicated to the county in August of 1949 with the National Park Service official present and speaking to the crowd. And again, a procession was led by an Episcopal priest and services were held during the ceremony. In 1964, the site became part of Point.
Wait, could we slow down a little bit?
Okay, if I have
Give
time.
more of an opportunity for, to give more of an opportunity for interpretation.
Yes, yes, thank you. So in 1964, the site became part of Point Reyes National Seashore, and the cross still stands in a grove of willow trees there. It should also be noted that Drake's Bay Archaeological and Historic District was designated by the federal government's National Park Service, or National Register of Historic Places in 2012. And only last Friday, a site named Nova Albion was accepted by the California State Historical Resources Commission and is being listed on the local, on the California registry. So the naming of the bay and the establishment of early commemorative sites at Drake's Bay no doubt led to much of the reasoning to name the new highway after Sir Francis Drake. But I think it's unlikely that these local merchants, residents, and religious figures had any detailed information about Drake's full history. In California at the time, his was a heroic story of a sea captain who circumnavigated the world and claimed the California shore for the Queen of England. So back to the road. The new Sir Francis Drake Highway stretched only 14 miles from Manor to Point Reyes Station. And the road to Inverness and the lighthouse was extended in the early 1930s and also became known as Sir Francis Drake Highway. Marvelous Marin and the newly formed Sir Francis Drake Highway Association publicized the new road around the country. The Sacramento Bee often mentioned the road, enticing its readers to leave the heat of the valley and experience the cool climate of West Marin's coast, which I could vouch for today. AAA featured the road in its guidebooks and maps, and it was seen as the first part of a network of roads from the East Bay and beyond that connected the interior of California with the coastal areas. In 1931, a portion of the eastern segment of the route, composed of the two roadways from Ross through Fairfax, was named Sir Francis Drake Boulevard at the request of civic leaders in San Anselmo and Fairfax. The intent was to increase traffic and commerce through their towns from the new Highway 101. The boulevard would connect with the already established Drake Highway and eliminate older street names through those communities. And in September of 1931, the name change was celebrated at an event at Marin Junior College. So these actions took place in the halls of town government, but the Marin County Board of Supervisors were a little slow to adopt the name Sir Francis Drake Highway. I researched their supervisors' minutes and the road minutes, and the name only appeared about a year after the dedication in the minutes. And not until 1933 did the board officially adopt Sir Francis Drake Boulevard for the collected roadways from Greenbrae to Point Reyes Station and beyond. The board also banned all advertising and billboards along the road. And of course, some businesses and organizations in San Geronimo Valley probably never got the memo about 90 years ago. But as planned, Sir Francis Drake Boulevard became the favorite route to the Marin coast. Marvelous Marin published this map in 1937 of the county, which depicted in cartoon form.
Dewey, this is a wonderful slide. I'm going to have to ask you to close here so that we can come back around to some questions.
Oh, it's already 20 minutes. Wow.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Enough for that.
So thank you really for that history and the clarity of the prompt for the naming of the road, and really where we, as or at least those who were in Marin at the time, how that decision was made. So now for those of you from the public who are with us, I want to let you know that the panelists, Vice Chair Ross, Dewey Livingston, Dr. Leeser, will turn their cameras back on, and of course, Matthew and Buffy, as we begin to transition to the question and answer. As I began to touch on at the beginning of this conversation, there have been quite a few bits of commentary, listening, and questions that have come in about the naming of this roadway, and particularly the renaming of this roadway. Several weeks ago, we began proactively collecting those questions, and in summary format, we'll begin to share them with the panel. In addition, and I want to encourage the almost 200 people who are on the line right at this moment, and I've watched that number go up and down, I want to encourage those of you who are here now to continue putting your questions in, and we will look at those in summary format also. So Vice Chair Ross, we're going to start with you. We've had quite a few questions come in with various wordings, but the core of those questions have been, what are some of the naming conventions that the Miwok people use for routes and lands? What are some of the names Miwok people could be interested in? What do you think of the naming?
Yeah, well, I think in discussion with our tribal council and tribal community, one is that it should be noted that, you know, we'd like to be involved and consulted with and the continuing dialogue. But more importantly, I think it's really about bringing back and restoring the history and the richness of the living tribes who is Coast Miwok of the Marin County. That said, our traditional language in Coast Miwok, we have no living speakers, although we have a revitalized language program with both Buffy and Matt oversee, and we have citizens engaged in relearning and revitalizing our language stock, which is of a traditional dialect that was spoken in Marin County, different dialects. It's important to understand. Oftentimes the language is different than how you would think of it in English or how we speak today. There's phrases and words that are often were not part of our everyday language. So those were new words and terms were often adapted and utilized the Spanish language. Oftentimes it was not uncommon for our ancestors to speak various dialects from all over the region. So that said, I think a lot of when you look at the traditional language of Miwok people and Native people, it's oftentimes tied to what's happening in the landscape. What is the cultural landscape feature? Is there a waterway? Is there a sloped way? Is that where there's an abundance of a rare medicinal plant that's used for healing and based on generation of knowledge and wisdom that's been passed on in relationship to place and space? And you know, Dewey touched on the various village names as well that expand. So I think those are some of the thoughts that we think about when we're looking at names in relevancy to what would you call something.
Thank you. Jordan, Dr. Lisa, there's quite a few questions, and I'll just pull out one. And you began to touch on very helpfully the perspectives on Sir Francis Drake, different authors and scholars. So several people have raised the Sugden book, some going to the extent of saying, what about page 10 in his book? But at base, a couple of people are saying things like the Sugden book exonerates Drake of the slave trade and makes him a champion of freed people. Other people say, is there any concurrence on the history of Drake? How would you help us think about those questions? One author, in theory, from this person exonerates him. Someone else says, is there enough evidence to triangulate or concur?
Wow, what great in-depth questions those sound like. I will do my best. If you don't mind, can I share my screen real quick? Is that okay?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll go back to the final point or category, and I'll just briefly touch on Sugden since there seems to be interest in him. He is the best representative of this school of thought that I would call the post-revisionist school, or he also published an article recently in the Sonoma Historian that is very much up from slavery. It's very much related to his role in slavery and what you're talking about. So there's more resources out there if you want to go straight to the source in this regard, which I would encourage you to do with any of these categories. And I don't know about exoneration. I don't think he used those terms, but he does talk about this idea of sort of, a young man. And one of my quotes here on the next page, I believe, is from that article itself. And again, this is that wall of text that you can probably read more closely later. But he talks about a group of people called the Cimarrones, and they play a pretty heavy role in a lot of the things that Drake does. And I think this is Sugden's best sort of synthesis and new evidence that he brings forth in his own biography. And Cimarrones are basically escaped slaves from the Spanish Main, basically from the Spanish world in the Americas. They had escaped either with by themselves or with help from any other groups down there, and they come into play in Drake's sort of privateering story, quite notably when he attacks the Nombre de Dios, which is in modern day Panama. And Drake had sort of really got to know some of these people quite well and basically developed alliances with them. And the great man biographies of the 1800s would have you think that, he and only 18 other Englishmen defeated the mule train, which is this moment. It's kind of bad planning by the Spanish, but basically they had the treasure fleet come pick up all the silver that was being mined out of South America and the gold about once a year. And they put it all on the same ships. So you can imagine literally putting all of your eggs in one basket. And the great man biographies would have you believe that these 18 Englishmen attacked this mule train, which was on El Camino Real down there. And they were able to defeat this sort of protected, or relatively poorly protected, but still protected Spanish mule train. In reality, he had the help of these Cimarrones. And I think the Sugden book does the best job of explaining that. And he goes on to say that so many people were sort of fans of this alliance, that one of them, in fact, a man named Diego, who even in the Kelsey book, he doesn't mention Diego, but he mentions the Fort Diego, which was named after this gentleman, who actually joins up with Drake. And there is some sources that would point out, because Diego makes it back to England at one point in time, that on the ship, Drake was very much sort of a proponent of equality. And again, these are English sources that would argue that, so we always have to look at it with a grain of salt. But there is that, and Sugden's evidence in this area is really quite quite good. And that's why I kind of labeled him as sort of a post-revisionist, because I think he accepts a lot of the revisionist work, and then he just sort of further does digging and then comes up with this. This is not to say that, Drake was not involved in the slave trade, which I wanted to show this image as well on the side here. This is the would-be crest of his cousin, John Hawkins. And Hawkins was, kind of the first ever slave trader for the British. And even though there is sort of the pause button gets hit on British involvement in the slave trade, he was not trying to pretend that he was doing something else. He may have started the trade, not, trading for Africans, but, we have very good evidence that, Drake was there when Hawkins, purchased 150 slaves or fought alongside African kings, and then attacked a neighboring African kingdom, and then took those people as sort of the spoils of war, so to speak. So I don't think Sugden would argue that, that didn't happen, or that one exonerates the other. But if you look at that quote, he does talk about, the fact that Drake was a young man when he did this, not working for himself or working for Hawkins. And then later in life, he does that. So I think Sugden would probably argue, and I've seen this 2 or 3 times, that he could have been involved in the slave trade, but not necessarily racist. And this has to do more with the sort of larger history of slavery and how that evolved very rapidly into more of a race version of slavery thereafter.
Thank you. Dewey, we have a question for you. Someone would like to know, and there are 2 or 3 questions around decision makers when the road was named. Who were the decision makers that really came up with this inspiration to choose the name of a pirate slave trafficker? Who else was involved? You're on mute.
The only names that I've run across, first of all, is Bill Salachi, who came up with the suggestion and wrote that letter. And it seemed to be the organization called Marvelous Marin that was involved a number of civic leaders and businessmen and this and that within the county. In the records of the Board of Supervisors, I don't see any particular names. In fact, they don't even mention it until a year later. So I can't really provide other names other than this group called Marvelous Marin.
I think the essence of the question was trying to figure out if there were a diversity of people of multiple backgrounds and perspectives ethnically involved.
I think it was politicians and businessmen, and I say men. And we could look in. We could find the names of the leaders of Marvelous Marin. Also, the people, the mayors and city council members in Fairfax and San Anselmo were involved in naming that portion through the Ross Valley. So that's all in the record. I don't have those names in front of me and could provide those news items and things if somebody would like.
Thank you. We'll try to summarize even more of the questions, ask you now, and then do some follow-up that can be posted in various places, asking all of you. So one general question before we go back to individually specific questions. I think a lot of people in the chat before and after were really interested in this idea of perspectives. And I think, Dr. Leeser, you really pulled out that at various moments in time, given who was speaking, given who was writing the history, given who wasn't involved, given what we think now, there were multiple perspectives. So a couple of questions come together around how can we keep the story and lessons alive without only thinking about honoring historical figures who led complex and, of course, brutal lives. So how do we keep the real stories alive and evolving without simply making it an opportunity to honor people who've had pasts that are brutal and complex as this question comes together? Any speaker on the panel want to talk about keeping history alive? I'm looking somewhat on my camera at you, Dr. Leeser, to start this conversation. And then, sorry for the pressure, but that was my best job at warning.
Okay, well, I'll take the subtle hint, I suppose. Yeah, they had there's been a recent dialogue also in Plymouth in England about a statue of Drake there. And in fact, a lot of sort of British historians have weighed in, and I think they had an interesting idea. And it's not so much that telling the whole story, I think, is kind of the general premise. I mean, there were a lot of terrible things happened. The 16th century was bloody and horrific, and Drake and Hawkins and these people contributed to that. And they were also victims to it at certain points in time as well. And I think really, just like we're kind of trying to do on this panels, is about sort of learning the longer, the bigger story, right? Trying to understand what it was for what it was, not trying to sort of heroicize anybody, but really just trying to understand what happened and seeing how we can learn from that. I think that's the general idea. I know in Plymouth, I think they added a lot of text to the monument. Of course, we're not talking about a monument here, but a road, which is a entirely different situation. But they added a very complete story, including big sections on sort of Hawkins and Drake's role on the slave trade. And I think that's.
So then, if I hear you saying expanding the story to bring in multiple perspectives is one way to begin to answer that question.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Are there other thoughts on that question before? We've gotten lots of great questions. So, other thoughts on that question?
I just want to expand on what Dr. said, because I think that there should be an understanding that, especially in this moment in time and the movement of Black Lives Matters and, the origin that really kicked off a lot of the what seems to be a controversy. We're all living through a new time, a time now where, people are looking at the past, and where there needs to be a real truth telling about the history. And there doesn't have to be blame or shame, but there certainly needs to be consideration in the here and now about equity and looking at the various people that have not been included in the colonized view, and how names and places have been shaped. And I think that's the opportunity that we have, and the responsibility we all inherit on whatever perspective, whatever your lineage is, that we all have that responsibility today moving forward.
Thank you. Dewey, would you like to weigh in on that question before we go to others? Other questions?
It just comes to mind that it doesn't appear to me that Marin County has done a whole lot of, in its history, of naming after great figures or figures out of history. And Sir Francis Drake Boulevard seems to be one of the exceptions. Whereas if you go to San Francisco, you have Cabrillo and Anza and all of these, and I know you go to other communities or places in the country where there are a lot of commemorating some figure, and you don't really see too much of that in Marin. Most of the roads, or many of the roads, are named after Tiburon, the road, the town of Tiburon for shark, and even like Lorelle was saying, that reflect the place or the creek or this or that. So that's.
Thank you. So starting with you, Lorelle, one question that seems to come up a couple of different times is, how can Marin County government and public groups best support unceded Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo through representation and elevation of messaging? So it's what's a next step kind of question. It seems that renaming boulevards and high schools seems like a crucial step in recognizing the history of the true stewards of this land. And I believe they're saying the Miwok peoples and their descendants.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I don't know if the boulevard will be renamed or not. If that comes forward as the community has been debating, I hope that we would continue to be able to have an ongoing dialogue. That's my hope from today's participation. We're not always invited or even thought of to be a part of the dialogue. So I appreciate the opportunity today and hope that will continue to be ongoing. Buffy mentioned a lot of the work that we do is in consultation regarding the protection of our cultural sacred sites and cultural landscapes. And, beyond concerns of that, I think it's really important that the residents of Marin understand and there be a more active acknowledgement, including and being inclusive of not just the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo folks of Graton Rancheria, but all Native Indigenous people, as well as other communities that are apart and maybe not fully represented, the Latinx community, as well as the African American community that is of the diversity within Marin County. In a county that's not very diverse and is one of the most expensive areas to live. So one way that I would say that, moving forward, I hope is for recognition and just having more opportunity to get public education out there and getting more visibility of who Graton Rancheria is, because we are the direct descendants of the Coast Miwok people of Marin County. And the land that is occupied today is predicated on stories and knowledge and a rich history of place and connection that we continue to have. And we're all having to take that responsibility and be accountable for asking for more inclusion. And, the next steps, I hope, would be more opportunity to continue to learn and create more space so that all voices, especially the Coast Miwok people, our history is known, as well as that we're alive and that we're a part of the community. We have an active child welfare cases in Marin County. Board of Supervisors have not been able to enter a MOU with the tribe around just general social services. We have been viewed and vilified over the years as a casino tribe and delegitimized by public and perception. And I think I want to say that, there's this missed opportunity of actually knowing who we are and our further commitment to the justice work we do every day in Marin County to protect our ancestral remains and our sacred lands and resources.
Thank you. I want us to pause for just a moment so that we can transition from one interpreter to another. And Buffy, I want to invite you, if you'd like to turn your camera on. You don't have to, but if you'd like to, you're absolutely welcome to sit with the rest of the panel. I will go back to a couple of other questions that we have. There's another question about historical evidence and building the historical evidence base around Sir Francis Drake. What are go-forward methods to do that that are accessible to the public? Because another part of the conversation that we'll come to in a moment begins to talk about why did we decide to do this? And while I can answer that question in a number of ways, how do we build the historical base on this figure and then maybe on other historical figures so it's more accessible? Thank you.
Happy to give my 2 cents, I suppose. There's sort of a subfield of historians that we call public historians, and they specialize sort of in the non-academic side. So a lot of times academic historians, we're kind of lonely people. We sit down and write a lot of stuff down, and then other historians read them, But the public historians are sort of like, we're trying to create content for the general public, right? And that can be sort of curators at museums or, cyber museumology. There's really a lot of things out there, and there is a sort of entire group of people, and I'm sure we have a number of them even in Marin County, that do this sort of thing for a living. They create, they take complicated issues and they find important ways to do that. And I do think that, when you have controversial topics, it is always one of, again, trying to give a full history, trying to give one of dialogue. And of course, key is also representing the fact that, this is going to be for all age groups as well, right? So you need to think about those sorts of issues when presenting, some sort of like maybe a permanent learning opportunity.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions coming along, and I'll offer them to the entire panel about Drake and an intentional racial nature to him and his engagement. One of the questions is around, can we talk about the association of Drake symbolism in this area with racial Anglo-Saxonism in the 19th and 20th century. And then another part of the question around Drake and intentionality around race, racism, and slavery is, why hasn't there been a more publicly clear stating that Drake was more than an instrument of the slave trade, that he wasn't following a trend, he was launching a trend that racialized slavery? Does anyone on the panel have information or thoughts about an intentional racialization of Drake?
There seems to be a couple different questions there. I think one of those questions is probably referring to Richard White's work, which is also in my idea. He wrote a New York Times opinion piece that was very popular, and it's really an excerpt from a larger book where he looks at sort of the mythology of California, and it's very much sort of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant mythology, and he likens this back to sort of things that happened in the early 1900s. So if he's referencing that, I would suggest looking directly at that source, the full book, because—
Would you restate that name and slowly?
Right, let me get the full title for you. I have it on my other— I'm not looking away, I'm looking at my other screen that I have over here. So.
No problem.
Right, it's California Exposures. I believe he works with his brother, who's a photographer, and they take pictures. And the first chapter is on Drake's Bay. And it's interesting. He's not really an expert on Drake, but he is a sort of he's a Stanford historian, and he is really good at at doing research and developing this idea of sort of history of mythology, or maybe like collective memory, you could call it potentially as well. So that text would be really where you want to go. And of course, he does cite, including Sugden and a number of the other authors that I talked about. So take a look at the sources of who he's looking at. But he's really interested in sort of, more things closer to what Dewey's timeline was than my own in this presentation, but sort of things that happened in California that led to that, not so much the legacy of Drake himself.
Thank you. Lorelle, did you have a thought on this one?
I think it's just also part of where we are in this arc in time, and there's safeness in being able to at least start a dialogue that at a different era in time was not safe to have, and I think that needs to be understood, and that piece of just being able to have safety and security to start looking at the diversity in which our communities are now, and how that lens looks back on history, and how we all take this moment in time to look at, and as we move forward. And those are my thoughts.
Thank you. We have go ahead, Dewey.
Oh, just one thing to say is that there's so much new coming out, and it's not necessarily new, as Jordan has mentioned, things that people have been writing, but if I go back to my high school days and growing up in California and going to high school in Marin County, and what we learned about Drake was more focused on that he landed in Marin County, or he was thought to, and the circumnavigation. And we never learned anything about the rest of his history, or not very much. And I think that's the general perspective of what people in the United States have learned about him, unless you really dig more deeply into some of these texts that Jordan has mentioned. And so I think that's been part of the problem, is that people just haven't been looking for the information, and it hasn't been offered. And so now is the time when so much more of that is coming out, and that's a really important part of what's going on today in our discussion today.
Thank you. So there's a question/comment about the renaming of the boulevard, and really looking more effectively now at the indigenous history and present of the region. And it kind of builds upon something that you said, Dewey, about the concept of Marvelous Marin and their idea of bringing more people and more tourists. And this question is, wouldn't we bring more tourists if we decided to acknowledge the history of the indigenous people of the land, and and really celebrate the community differently. There's a question for Dr. Leeser to explain presentism to the Zoom crowd about how we look back at history through a present lens and what that means.
Sure. I mean, I guess it's more of a concept than anything else. And the idea of, we're always looking back within the eyes of where we are today, which is why the historiography is so important to understand. Before you can really understand Drake, you have to understand where the people that tell you about Drake, where they're coming from. And one of the things that comes up a lot is sort of, the morals of today are the way that we look backwards. And every author is always, of course, sort of encumbered by the morals of the time period that they're writing in, and they're looking backwards. So a lot of times that term is used when we sort of reflect our current sort of morality onto someone living a long time ago. I think that's probably what the person is suggesting.
So one of the other pieces that's come up is, can any of you really offer or suggest even more texts and documents that can be read as we move forward? We have put together, and I believe I mentioned this at the top of the conversation, on the Marin County Free Library's website, a page that's collected resources from multiple perspectives, and that primarily has some adult resources, but we're continuing to build out the component for youth and for young people. Maybe this is a good time to reach out to Matthew and to Buffy to think about some resources that you might have, either actual books, text items, or things to look at.
I'm going to, I actually have a prop here behind me. This book is called Interviews with Tom Smith and Maria Copa. And this is a text that I refer to all the time. We refer to it all the time in our department when we're doing research. And this is interviews with two elders, Tom Smith and Maria Copa. Tom Smith has ancestry in Marin County and Sonoma County, and Maria Copa is has ties to Marin County. And this really gives a lot of information about the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo culture, and is a really vast resource that I'm still finding new things every day. And also, I would just encourage, part of the work we do is taking in questions from the general public, and our department is fortunate to have really opening communications with Lorelle and our tribal council, and if we don't know the answer, we can go through our materials that we have to kind of find out more information. And also we have the really fortunate position to be in contact with a lot of elders who have been doing cultural preservation work for 50 or more years. And so they're a tremendous resource to go to and to learn from. And I consider myself very fortunate to be able to speak with those elders, and I learn from them all the time.
Thank you. Let's take a pause for a moment so that we can switch interpreters. So we have about 5 more minutes left in our planned time. So thinking about that 5 minutes, generally, I want to give each of the 5 of you, a minute or so to give closing comments. I'd like to make sure that in that lineup, you're able, Lorelle, to give the info ad, or Matthew, you could give that information also, because you offered people the opportunity to reach out to you. So we're definitely willing to do that. And then as I close, not only will I thank each of you, but there were a few general questions about how did we select the panelists and where will future resources be and things like that. So I will close on those notes. Dewey, since we ended our panel conversation with you, how about we work our way back up? Why don't you start the final words, and then we'll go on to Jordan, we'll go to Buffy and Matthew, and we'll end with Lorelle and then me.
Okay, well, I didn't come onto this panel as a Drake expert at all. I've been a local historian, and that has not been one of the subjects that I've even focused on. But it's always been interesting to me, you know, relative to the rest of the history of the county. And so I think what I learned the most in studying the history of the road itself was this environment in which, when it was named that, I think that there was a fair amount of ignorance, and ignorance in the gentle way of that, of just not really knowing the whole story. It wasn't a diverse group of people making that name. It was to bring money, in a sense, or bring activity to the county. And so I think that could be one of the points in determining whether it's an appropriate name, even beyond the history of Drake and the things he had done during his life.
Thank you, Dewey.
Thanks.
Jordan.
All right. Yeah. Well, I'd like to show a quick picture. Sorry, I'm going to keep doing this.
No problem.
As long as I'm here, I'm going to keep sharing stuff that I have.
Yeah.
There is a picture on the right here that I've never had a chance to address. And this is I think this represents the sort of complexity of history better than I can describe it myself. This is the Drake Jewel, as it's come to be known. And it was given in the 1580s to Sir Francis Drake after knighthood by Queen Elizabeth I. And what's interesting about it, not only is it, of course, valuable with pearls and gems on it, but it was not uncommon for Queen Elizabeth to give a jewel like this to somebody. And usually it had her portrait on it, which is what the other side of this gem you can't really see has. And it's in a very famous museum in London now. And the thing that's unique about this one is the one that was given to Drake is that the other side has an image as well. Maybe take a close look at it. You see there's sort of two profiles right in the background. You see a white figure, almost like a Greek statue. And there's no consensus whether that's a man or a woman, but they're clearly white. And then in front of that person, there's a profile of a black man, very African in sort of dress. And there's a kind of a riddle to history is sort of what does this mean? And I mentioned Sugden before. Given his work on the Cimarrones, he has a theory about this, and he believes that it is relating to Drake's sort of later in life union with the African peoples that were freed in the Spanish Main. And the idea would be is that the most sort of glorifying thing that Drake did for England is that he helped defeat the Spanish. And of course, these were the allies, or the enemy of my enemy at the very least, right, in the Americas. Now, there's other people that look at this, and you know, not a lot of scholarly historians address this particular jewel because it is just sort of one little artifact. But they would look at this and say, no, it's a reference to the Hawkins slave trade, right? More like the picture I say on the other side, and this sort of connection in that way. And again, the complexity, I think, of history is so high for this particular topic that it's these sort of things that really, I think, explain how much there is out there to study and learn, and why the books about this particular guy that lived 400 years ago were like 700 pages long. All right, so I think I'll leave it with that illustration.
Thank you. Matthew.
I think a thought that keeps coming to mind for me is, you know, we're talking about the act of renaming a street, but I think that's really just a starting place, and that there's a lot of work to do to bring to light the history of the first people of Marin County. It is a significant gesture, but I think for so long and over so many generations and within the school systems, we've had that focus on the European perspective, the focus on the history of Drake in the area. And I think it's really a great opportunity that we have right now that we've been invited to the table, so to speak, to really start to bring that other perspective into focus. I think that's it's an important step, but we can't just stop with renaming a street and call it good.
Thank you. Buffy, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Chantel. This has been a very enlightening discussion. I think, one of the things that sort of just keeps coming back around in my mind is, the tribe is in a different place than I think, at a time when, the roads were named. And I think the tribe now has a mechanism. The tribe is a sovereign nation and has the ability to work with governments, different entities, agencies. We can across all government spectrum, and the tribe has the capacity to do that work and to have that dialogue. And this is really an opportunity, like the vice chair said, to really embrace that opportunity that the tribe is really extending right now, a hand to say, let's all sit down and think about this together. Let's think about not just one street as a one-off victory. Let's think about, a bigger picture, that's all inclusive of not just Native people, but all people who are in Marin County. So I think that's really what resonates for me, in this discussion. So I hope that we can do that.
Thank you. Lorelle.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to all the other panelists and to you, Chantel, and the audience. Similar to Matt and Buffy, and here in this point in time of our history and part of the community that we're all involved and engaged in, we're talking about someone who was here in a brief time and, is a good marketing strategy. What leaves me to want to state for the audience to be thinking about more of what could you know about your home, your backyard, your front yard, your neighbor, the road you drive on, imagining that there's so much more history and knowledge of place that we all call home that we yet to learn and know. And this panel discussion is just a very skim of the surface of that, and why you don't hear more or see more on who the Coast Miwok people are. That should be the question, because there's not a drive that I don't take in Marin County, and there's not a ride I don't take with an elder through Marin County, that there isn't so much more story and history that's alive and living to be told and understood. And it's not just one person. It's in time, hundreds of years ago or 100 years ahead. It is a place, and it's part of who we all are now. And I invite for you to think about that as a tribal perspective, is that we should all know as much about the Coast Miwok people as we do about Sir Francis Drake, if not more.
Thank you. So I'll close by saying thank you to each of the panelists. Thank you for this evening. Thank you for the preparation. Thank you for saying yes and joining us, and for the information that you've offered that we've put on the website, and for the direct contacts that we hope many people will reach out and learn about your work, either through writings or through the recording that's coming forward. One of the questions that came during this session, as well as before, was how did we select this panel? And one of the things that I would like to say is thank you to the many people who were a part of it. Lori, definitely, members of the library team, lots of folks were a part of the conversation. And as questions started to come up about the Boulevard, we really looked at who are scholars and local folks who know the roadway, who know the history of the people on this land, and who really have perspectives on Drake and have been doing something active with Sir Francis Drake. And we were able to pull together a panel with multiple perspectives who contributed to resources that we have put together. One of the things that we did not cover on this panel was what would the physical changes, if the road were renamed, what would that cost? And what are the next steps in the process? What I can say is there are many jurisdictions and people and stakeholders involved in this conversation. More information about that will follow. It'll come through multiple sources, but as the library, as people who pull together information, gather it so that our communities can connect, can learn, can grow. As the library that focuses on inclusion and equity, we will post the information about next steps to help people remain informed and engaged. And I want to thank all of you for spending your evening here. I know there were other things going on tonight, so it was nice that you were here. Thank you, everyone, and we will end this session now.